James Mitchell, a retired federal judge, stepped into the park on a sunny afternoon, a faint smile playing on his lips. It had been years since he left his position on the bench, but the memories of those years were still fresh in his mind. The cases, the rulings, the debates, all the moments that made up his distinguished career still echoed in his thoughts. Yet, at this stage in his life, James had chosen peace over the hustle of courtroom drama. Now, he walked the paths of the park in his comfortable sneakers, watching the kids play and the joggers pass by. It was a rare quiet moment in the busy life he'd led. He had earned this peace, after decades of hard work in the justice system, dealing with complex and often heartbreaking cases. His reputation as a fair and thoughtful judge was well known, but in this small, quiet park, he was just another elderly man, enjoying his day. He paused for a moment, sitting on one of the park benches. It was a spot he often came to, watching the world go by in a slow and steady rhythm. People often gave him a polite nod as they passed, recognizing his face from the few public appearances he still made, though many of them didn't know the depth of his past. In this park, he was simply James the retired judge, a quiet man who preferred not to talk about his past. As he sat there, enjoying the serenity, a group of young men entered the park. They were loud, laughing boisterously, their voices carrying over the peaceful atmosphere. James barely looked up. It was common to hear such groups in the park, and their energy didn't disturb him. After all, what was life without a little bit of noise and youthful excitement? However, the group's laughter took on a different tone as they approached his bench. At first, James thought nothing of it. They were young, probably just enjoying their afternoon. But as they passed by, one of the men, a tall guy with a scruffy beard, stopped. He looked at James for a moment, then turned to his friends with a grin. The group slowly gathered around, standing a little too close, their presence making James uncomfortable in an unexpected way. His peaceful afternoon was about to be interrupted, but he wasn't one to cause a scene. So, he kept his eyes forward, hoping they would just move on. But they didn't. "Hey, old man," the guy said loudly, his voice carrying across the park, "what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at home?" The others snickered, their laughter filled with mockery. James, keeping his calm, ignored the comment, hoping they would lose interest. He'd learned long ago to not engage with people like this. It wasn't worth it. But the taunts continued. "Bet you don't even know where you are," one of the younger men added, his words dripping with contempt. The group continued to make jokes about James's age, his appearance, and even his slow movements. They seemed to think it was all a game, a way to prove they were tough or clever by bullying someone who wouldn't fight back. Their laughter grew louder, more intense. James felt the tension rise, but he remained composed. He had dealt with far worse in his years as a judge. He knew how to handle difficult situations. His calm demeanor, though, only seemed to spur the group on. It was like they were testing him, seeing how far they could push before he responded. One of the men, slightly bolder than the rest, stepped even closer to James. He sneered, looking at him as if he were nothing more than a joke. "What's the matter, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue?" The insult stung, but James didn't show it. He had learned over the years that showing weakness in situations like this only made things worse. Instead of reacting, he focused on the world around him. The wind rustled the leaves in the trees. A dog barked in the distance. Children played and laughed. Life moved on, despite the interruption. James turned his head slightly, still not looking directly at the young man. His voice, when he finally spoke, was calm and steady. "I'm just enjoying the day," he said, his tone as neutral as he could manage. "I'd suggest you do the same." The group fell silent for a moment, but the silence didn't last long. The taunts started up again, louder this time. They began to surround him, forming a circle around the bench. "What, "You think you're too good to talk to us?" one of them asked. James knew that his presence was being tested now, not just his silence. They were probing for weakness, trying to see if they could push him into reacting. He could feel the heat rising from their bodies, the tension in the air. He didn't flinch. "Listen," James said, still calm, "I've lived a long life. I don't need to engage with you." His eyes moved over to the park's entrance, hoping someone would notice what was going on, but the park seemed unusually empty at this time. There were only a few people in the distance, not close enough to intervene. The young men continued to jeer, getting bolder with every moment. One of them stepped forward, a smirk on his face. "You can't just sit here and ignore us. We're talking to you." James felt his heartbeat quicken, but his face remained a mask of calm. He knew how this could end. He had seen it before, in courtrooms, in streets, in every corner of life when people felt empowered by their numbers or their own arrogance. They pushed, testing to see who would break. And James wasn't going to break. It was then that the bully's hand suddenly reached out, grabbing James's arm in a move that was more aggressive than playful. James, still unfazed, slowly turned his head and looked up at the young man. "Let go of me," he said, his voice low, the calm intensity unmistakable. "I've dealt with far worse in my life. This is beneath me." But the man, clearly not ready to back down, kept his grip tight, pulling James slightly to the side. "Old man, what are you going to do about it?" James stood up, his movements slow but deliberate. The bullies didn't realize yet who they were dealing with. They saw an elderly man, a quiet figure, a target. What they didn't know was that they were about to face someone far more powerful than they had ever imagined. The young man's grip on James's arm was firm, but James didn't flinch. His calmness, though, only seemed to annoy the group even more. The others circled around him, watching his every move with wide, expectant eyes. It was clear that they wanted a reaction, something that would prove they had the power in this situation. They wanted James to show fear, to back down. But James wasn't afraid. He stood there, silently, his eyes meeting the young man's, who still held his arm. James felt the weight of their gazes, the tension in the air, but his thoughts remained clear. He wasn't going to fight, and he wasn't going to be intimidated. He had dealt with much worse in his career as a judge, handling heated courtroom arguments and fierce debates, always with the same calm demeanor. He had learned long ago that the more you let someone get under your skin, the more control you lose. And control was something he wouldn't give up so easily. The bully, still holding onto James's arm, scoffed and gave a slight tug, as if trying to force James into submission. "What's wrong, old man? You gonna just stand there like a statue?" James looked around the park again, noticing that no one was stepping forward to help. People were too afraid, too hesitant to get involved. It was the same in many situations. People saw things happening around them, but often turned a blind eye. He had seen it in his years of experience. People saw injustice, but many chose to ignore it, hoping it would pass them by. But this time, James wasn't going to let that happen. With a deep breath, he gently pulled his arm out of the young man's grip. It wasn't a forceful move, just a calm, steady motion that showed he wasn't going to be controlled. He straightened his back, looking each of them in the eye. "I don't want trouble. I'm simply here to enjoy my day. If you continue this, you'll regret it." The group fell silent for a moment. They hadn't expected him to respond like this. The young man, still holding on to his bravado, sneered, trying to save face. "Oh, really? What are you gonna do about it, old man?" He stepped forward again, pushing his chest against James's, a clear challenge. But James stood still. His expression remained unchanged. "I've seen far more dangerous situations than this in my life," he said calmly. "And I've handled them. So, unless you're looking for trouble, I suggest you leave me be. The bully's eyes flickered for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He was used to picking on people who wouldn't stand up for themselves, people who would shrink away at the slightest challenge. But James wasn't like that. His years of experience, his calm authority, and the quiet power he radiated threw the young man off. It was like he was facing someone far more formidable than just an elderly man. One of the other men in the group, sensing the shift, nudged the bully. "Come on, let's just go. He's not worth it." But the leader wasn't ready to back down. He was determined to show his friends that he could control the situation, that he was the one in charge. "Don't listen to him," the bully muttered, turning back to James. "I bet you don't even know who you're talking to. You think you can just talk down to me like that? You have no idea what I can do." James, still calm, shook his head. "I don't care about who you are. What matters is how you treat others. And right now, you're showing a lack of respect." His voice was soft, but his words hit like a steady drum beat, firm and unwavering. The young man paused, his arrogance faltering for a moment. He didn't know how to handle someone who wasn't reacting with fear or anger. He wasn't used to people like James, people who had seen enough of life to know that getting worked up over petty insults wasn't worth it. His confusion was clear on his face, but he wasn't about to let that show in front of his friends. "Whatever, man," the bully muttered, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice. "Let's go. This guy's just too weird." But before they could walk away, something unexpected happened. A park security guard appeared at the edge of the scene, a tall, authoritative figure with a stern expression. The guard had been walking his usual rounds when he had noticed the group of young men surrounding James. He had been trained to recognize situations that could escalate, and this one was clearly teetering on the edge of violence. "Hey," the security guard called out, his voice booming across the park. "What's going on here? Is there a problem?" The group froze. They hadn't seen the guard approach. The bully who had been leading the harassment looked over at him, a sneer still on his face. "We're just having some fun, no need to get involved." The guard took a step forward, his eyes scanning the group. "I don't think it's fun to harass people in the park, especially an elderly man." His gaze shifted to James, who was still standing, calm and composed. "Sir, are you all right?" James gave a small nod, his voice steady. "I'm fine. These young men just don't understand the value of respect." The guard turned his attention back to the group of bullies, his expression hardening. "I suggest you all leave before I call the authorities. I'm sure they'd love to hear about your little fun session." The young men exchanged nervous glances. The atmosphere had shifted. They had been confident just moments before, but now they were unsure. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The guard's presence was a reminder that there were rules, laws, and consequences for their actions. "Let's go," the bully muttered to his friends, motioning for them to leave. Reluctantly, they turned and began to walk away, but not before giving James one last look. Their arrogance had been replaced with hesitation. James watched them leave, his heart still calm, but his thoughts were clear. He knew what had just happened wasn't just about him. It was about respect. It was about standing up for what's right, even when others try to put you down. The bullies hadn't realized who they were targeting, but they had learned something important today. It wasn't just about the power to push someone around, it was about the strength to stand your ground and hold onto your dignity, no matter who you were. The security guard turned to James, his expression softening. "You handled that well, sir. Are you sure you're okay?" James gave him a reassuring smile. "I'm fine. I've had my fair share of challenges, and I know when to stay calm. But thank you for stepping in." The guard nodded and walked away, leaving James alone again in the park, the silence returning. James sat back down on the bench, his thoughts still with the young men, now far off in the distance. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He wasn't just an elderly man sitting in the park anymore. He had proven that he was someone to be respected not because of his age, but because of the wisdom he carried and the strength he held within. And as the sun began to set, James felt at peace once again, knowing that sometimes, standing up for yourself didn't require a fight. It just required the courage to stay calm and show who you really were. The group of bullies reluctantly walked away, their heads hung low and their pride shattered. The moment they were out of earshot, James took a deep breath and looked around the park again. The sound of children playing in the distance, the soft rustling of the trees in the breeze, and the chirping of birds filled the air once more. The peace he had once felt returned slowly, like a tide coming back after a storm. He was back to his moment of quiet reflection, as if nothing had happened. But he knew that not everything would just go away. As the group disappeared from view, James thought about what had just transpired. These young men had no idea who he was. To them, he was just an easy target, a person they could push around without thinking twice. But to James, their actions were a painful reminder of the disrespect that seemed to be growing in the world. His thoughts were interrupted when the park's security guard, the one who had stepped in earlier, came back toward him. The guard was walking at a steady pace, clearly trying to figure out if James was truly okay. He had seen many confrontations in his time working at the park, but it wasn't every day that he witnessed an elderly man handle a situation with such calmness and authority. "You sure you're all right, sir?" the guard asked, his voice softer now, as if he was genuinely concerned. James gave the man a kind smile. "I'm fine, young man. Thank you for stepping in." The guard looked relieved, but there was a lingering curiosity in his eyes. "I've seen you around here before. You don't look like someone who'd get involved in something like that." James chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "I'm just an old man, trying to enjoy a peaceful afternoon. But sometimes, you can't just sit back and let things slide." The guard raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Yeah, I saw how you handled it. You didn't even flinch. Not many people can do that, especially with a group of guys like that." James's smile faded slightly as he looked down at the ground for a moment, thinking about the younger men. He had seen that kind of behavior before, both in and out of courtrooms. People who believed that their age, their position, or their race gave them power over others. He had encountered it countless times as a judge, whether it was in the form of prejudice, bullying, or just plain cruelty. And while it had often been his job to deal with such things, he couldn't help but feel that society was still struggling with these issues. Sometimes, people need to be reminded that respect goes both ways, James said, his voice quiet but firm. They don't always realize the impact of their actions, especially when they've never had to deal with consequences. The security guard nodded slowly, understanding what James meant. "Yeah, you're right. Some people just don't get it. They think they can get away with anything because they haven't been held accountable." James nodded, his eyes following the path the group had taken. "That's exactly it. It's easy to be bold when you don't know what it's like to have someone stand up to you. They were trying to assert their power over me, but they didn't know that I've been in situations far worse than that. And I wasn't about to let them think they could intimidate me." The guard took a step back, still processing what James had said. He seemed to be considering the gravity of the situation more deeply. After a moment, he spoke again. "Yeah, well, you sure taught them a lesson they won't forget," the guard said with a hint of a smile. "I've never seen someone handle a situation like that so calmly." James shrugged lightly, as if what he had done wasn't all that remarkable. "It's all about keeping your head. The moment you lose your temper, you lose control. It's not easy, but it's the only way to keep your dignity." The guard looked at him with respect, and for a moment, there was a shared understanding between them. The guard had likely seen many confrontations during his time at the park, but this was different. It wasn't just about the confrontation itself, it was about the way James had responded. His calm, composed nature in the face of aggression had shown a kind of strength that couldn't be measured by physical power alone. "Well, I'll make sure they don't come back," the guard said, straightening up as he spoke. "And if they do, I'll be keeping a closer eye on them." James nodded. "Thank you, but don't worry about it. I'll be fine. I've learned how to handle situations like this. Besides, I'm sure they've learned their lesson." The guard gave him a respectful nod before turning to walk away. As he left, James was left with his thoughts again. He looked out over the park, his gaze distant as he watched the peaceful scene unfold around him. The contrast between the chaos he had just experienced and the calm of the world around him was striking. He had lived a long life, one filled with both triumphs and struggles, and moments like this reminded him why he had chosen the path he had. He had chosen to be a judge because he believed in fairness, in justice. It had been his life's work to ensure that people were held accountable for their actions. But now, in his retirement, James realized that justice didn't always have to come in the form of a ruling or a verdict. Sometimes, justice was as simple as standing your ground and showing people that their actions had consequences. As James sat on the bench, he thought back to his career in the courtrooms. He remembered the complex cases he had dealt with, the tough decisions he had made, and the many times he had seen individuals try to manipulate the system. But he had never allowed them to win. He had never allowed them to walk away without paying for their mistakes. And today, that same sense of justice had carried him through this small confrontation in the park. But there was something else, something even more important, that James had learned throughout his life. It wasn't just about standing up to people when they were wrong, it was about showing kindness, about trying to understand where others were coming from. He had spent years in courtrooms where people were often at their worst, and while he had to be firm, he also had to listen. He had learned that, in the end, it was understanding and respect that truly made the difference. As he sat there, lost in thought, James felt a sense of peace. The day was still beautiful, the world still turning, and he knew that, despite the small bumps along the way, everything would be all right. And for the bullies who had tried to push him around, James knew that life had a way of teaching lessons even when you weren't looking for them. Sometimes, it was the quiet, calm people who had the most power. They just had to wait for the right moment to show it. As the moments passed, the tension in the park began to fade, but James's mind remained active, processing the events that had just unfolded. He knew that the situation with the group of young men wasn't as simple as it seemed. It wasn't just about one confrontation in the park, it was a reflection of a larger issue that ran deep in society. He had dealt with many people over the years, but he had never forgotten how important it was to approach each person with dignity and respect. What had happened today was a small, yet significant reminder of how quickly disrespect could escalate into something worse, and how important it was to stand firm in moments like this. James glanced around the park again. The sun was slowly dipping lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden glow over the trees and paths. The park, which had been filled with noise just moments earlier, was now quiet again. The birds still sang, the wind still rustled the leaves, and the children were still playing. Life went on, unaffected by the brief disruption. But James was different now. He wasn't the same man he had been just an hour ago. He had just stood up to a group of bullies without raising a hand, without resorting to violence or anger. And in doing so, he had regained something that many people seem to lose over time: the ability to maintain composure, to show that real power wasn't in loud voices or aggressive actions, but in the quiet confidence of knowing who you were and what you stood for. As he sat back on the bench, his thoughts returned to the bullies. He hadn't been angry with them, not in the way they had expected. Anger would have been a loss of control, a failure to maintain his sense of self. But calm? Calm was something else. Calm gave you the space to think clearly, to make decisions without the cloud of emotion. And that, James knew, was the true test of strength. He wondered about the young men, where they were now, what they were thinking. Were they still laughing, still mocking others, or had the encounter with him changed their perspective, even just a little bit? He knew the world wasn't always so kind, and people like the young men he had encountered were often products of their environment. They had likely grown up in places where respect wasn't taught, where aggression was the only way to prove your worth. It wasn't an excuse, but it was an explanation. James had spent his career seeking justice, but even as a judge, he had learned that the system couldn't always change a person's heart. Sometimes, it took something simpler, a moment of understanding, a moment of standing firm in the face of cruelty. Sometimes, it was just a matter of showing people that their actions had consequences. As James sat lost in thought, a woman walking her dog passed by and nodded politely at him. He smiled back, his mind still partly focused on the events earlier. But the woman's presence reminded him that life didn't stop for anyone. It kept moving, and so must he. Suddenly, he heard a voice calling his name. It was the security guard again, this time with a friendly wave as he approached. The guard seemed more relaxed now, a far cry from the stern authority he had shown earlier. It was clear that the situation had resolved itself, and James was no longer in any danger. "Hello again, sir," the guard said, his tone lighter now. "Just wanted to make sure everything's still all right." James gave the man a warm smile. "Everything's fine now. Thank you again for your help." The guard nodded, clearly happy to see that the situation hadn't escalated further. "I don't think I've ever seen someone handle those kinds of guys the way you did. I mean, I've had to break up fights before, but you didn't even raise your voice." James chuckled softly. Sometimes, the best way to handle a situation is not to handle it at all, at least not in the way they expect. If you give in to anger, you lose the upper hand. The guard raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by James's wisdom. "You make it sound so easy. I guess we could all learn something from that." James shrugged lightly. "It's not always easy, but it's necessary. We're all tested in different ways, and how we respond is what matters. Not every fight has to be fought with fists. Sometimes, the best weapon is just the ability to stay calm and keep your dignity." The guard stood there for a moment, considering James's words. "I think I get it now. You don't just protect the people around you, you protect your own peace of mind too." James smiled. "Exactly. And sometimes, protecting your peace means not engaging with every fight that comes your way." The guard nodded thoughtfully. "I'll remember that. Thanks again for the advice." With that, the guard turned and walked off, leaving James alone once more. But James didn't feel lonely. In fact, he felt more at peace than he had all afternoon. The park around him, which had seemed like a battleground moments earlier, now seemed like a safe haven again. Life, as it always did, had found its balance once more. As the sun continued to set, James sat there, his mind now calm, his body at ease. He knew that the day had not just been about standing up to a group of bullies, it had been about something much more profound. It had been about teaching himself, and perhaps the people around him, that the true strength in life was not in how loud you could be or how much you could fight. The true strength was in your ability to stay true to yourself, to remain calm when everything around you seemed to be falling apart, and to know when to stand up for what was right. He looked down the path where the young men had walked away, their figures now barely visible in the distance. He didn't wish them harm. He didn't want revenge. What he wanted, what he always wanted, was for them to understand what it meant to treat others with respect. Maybe they would learn that lesson today, maybe not. But James had done his part. He had shown them, through his actions, what it meant to be the bigger person. And that, he realized, was all he could do. The rest was up to them. As the park grew quieter and the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the trees, James stood up from the bench. It had been a long, thoughtful afternoon, but it was time to go home. He had spent so many years serving others, making decisions that affected the lives of many people. Now, in his retirement, he found that the best way to serve was simply by being a peaceful, respectful presence in the world. With that thought in mind, James slowly walked toward the park's exit, the cool evening air brushing against his face, feeling at peace with the world around him. As James walked out of the park and made his way down the familiar path toward his home, his mind still buzzed with the events of the afternoon. The park was quieter now, the noise of children's laughter replaced by the distant hum of cars and the occasional chirp of a cricket. It had been a strange day, one that would stay with him for a long time. Not because of the confrontation with the bullies, but because of the reminder it brought. A reminder that respect, dignity, and calm were still the most powerful tools anyone could have. The evening air was cool, and James pulled his jacket tighter around him. It had been a while since he'd walked home, and as he made his way down the street, he couldn't help but notice the way the light of the setting sun cast long shadows on the pavement. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, but to James, it felt like everything was moving in slow motion. The events in the park had grounded him in a way he hadn't expected. As he neared his home, he could see his porch light glowing softly in the distance. His house was simple, nothing extravagant, but it was his. It was a place where he could find peace after years of working in a system that never stopped, a system that demanded so much from him. Now, in retirement, James had the luxury of enjoying the quieter things in life, simple pleasures like a warm meal, a good book, or just sitting on the porch, watching the world go by. When he stepped inside, the smell of freshly brewed coffee greeted him. His daughter, Emily, was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a book. She looked up when she heard him come in, offering him a smile that always warmed his heart. Emily had always been his anchor, the one person who truly understood the weight of the decisions he had made over the years. She had been by his side through it all, and though she was grown now, living her own life, there was always a comfort in knowing that she was close. "Good evening, Dad," she said, setting her book aside. "How was your day?" James smiled and dropped his jacket on the back of a chair. "It was an interesting day, to say the least." Emily raised an eyebrow, sensing that something more had happened than what her father was letting on. She knew him well enough to understand that he wouldn't speak of his troubles unless it was necessary. "What happened?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. James sat down at the table across from her, his fingers tapping gently on the surface as he collected his thoughts. "Well, I had a bit of an encounter in the park." Emily waited patiently for him to continue, knowing her father had a way of telling stories without rushing. "There were some young men in the park," he began. "They were being disrespectful, trying to provoke me, make fun of me. At first, I didn't react. I just sat there, hoping they'd move on. But they kept at it, getting bolder. One of them even grabbed my arm." He paused, looking into Emily's eyes. "But I didn't let them get to me. I stayed calm, and in the end, they walked away." Emily looked at her father with admiration. "I'm proud of you, Dad. Not everyone would have handled that so calmly." James chuckled softly. "It wasn't easy. But I've learned that the best way to deal with such things isn't to react in anger or frustration. It's to keep your peace, to stay true to yourself. I've been in tough situations before, but today reminded me that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply remain calm." Emily nodded thoughtfully, her eyes reflecting a mixture of pride and understanding. "I think you're right. People like that are used to pushing others around because they think they can. But they probably never expected you to stand your ground without getting upset." "That's exactly it," James replied. "They didn't realize who they were dealing with. But I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted to remind them that respect goes both ways." Emily leaned back in her chair, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "It sounds like they learned something today." "I hope so," James said, looking out the window as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon. "Sometimes people need to be shown that their actions have consequences. But more than that, they need to understand that respect doesn't come from fear or intimidation. It comes from treating others with dignity." The room was quiet for a moment as the weight of his words hung in the air. Emily could sense that her father was reflecting on the larger picture, thinking not just about what had happened in the park, but about the world as a whole. It was something James had always been passionate about, teaching others the importance of respect and justice, not just through his work as a judge, but through the example he set in his everyday life. "So, what happens now?" Emily asked, breaking the silence. "Do you think they'll come back? Or did they learn their lesson?" James sighed softly, his gaze still distant. "I'm not sure. They may never truly understand the lesson. But I did what I could. It's not about getting revenge or making them suffer, it's about showing them a better way, if only for a moment. And that's all I can control." Emily reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You've always been about making the world a better place, Dad. One person at a time." James smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "It's not much, but it's something. If we all took a moment to show respect to others, the world might be a little better." As the evening settled in, they shared a quiet dinner together, the comfortable silence between them a testament to the deep bond they shared. James knew that he couldn't change the world on his own, but he could change the way he responded to it. And in doing so, he hoped to inspire others to do the same. Later that night, after dinner, James sat on the porch, the cool night air settling around him. He looked out over the quiet neighborhood, his thoughts drifting back to the young men in the park. He hoped that, in some small way, he had made a difference. Maybe they wouldn't remember the encounter for long, but perhaps, just maybe, they would think twice before treating someone else with disrespect. In the end, James knew that change didn't always come in big, dramatic ways. Sometimes, it came from the quiet moments, the moments when you chose to stand firm in your values, even when it wasn't easy. He had done that today, and he was at peace with it. As the stars twinkled above and the world around him settled into a peaceful quiet, James felt a deep sense of contentment. He had stood up for himself, for the values he believed in, and for the idea that respect was the foundation of all human interaction. And in that quiet, simple act, he had found something more valuable than any victory in a courtroom: true peace of mind.